This is a continuation of the single greatest witch hunt of all time. We have a rogue judge who rules that properties are worth a tiny fraction, 1/100th, a tiny fraction of what they actually are. We have a racist attorney general who's a horror show, who ran on the basis that she was going to get Trump before she even knew anything about me. She used this to run for governor. She failed in her attempt to run for governor. She had virtually no polling. She came back and she said, well, now I'll go back to get Trump again. And this is what we have. It's a scam. It's a sham. The crime is against me because we have a corrupt district attorney, but we have a corrupt attorney general. And it all comes down from the DOJ. They totally coordinated this in Washington because I'm the leading candidate. I'm leading Biden by 10 points.
That was former President Donald Trump speaking moments before entering the courtroom in New York City for the $250 million civil fraud case that Letitia James launched against him. Here he is in the courtroom, and you can see James in the crowd. All right. So that was an interesting choice for pushback, from Donald Trump. I think last week we covered there was a kind of preliminary judgment by the court that basically the basis of the fraud was already decided as true because it was based on the documents. So among the things that Trump had misrepresented was the financial value of Mar-a-Lago. The court found that he consistently overvalued Mar-a-Lago by as much as 2,300%. The judge also rebuked Trump for lying about the size of his Manhattan apartment. He claimed the 3-story Trump Tower penthouse was nearly 3 times its actual size, which resulted in an overvaluation. And so he seems to have been particularly bristling at the court's decision on the fundamental fraud issue. What do you make of his choice to be rankled at that in particular?
Well, I actually understand it because, first of all, I think it was pretty absurd that the judge issued this summary judgment in the first place at the direction of Letitia James ahead of the trial, basically already setting the stage for these claims to be found true. I mean, he's basically poisoned a jury at this point.
But a summary judgment on factual issues that can be decided on the basis of documents that's not at all unusual. You don't need a jury to establish whether or not the square footage of an apartment is as advertised or not. Or similarly, there was some kind of check fraud. Either there was a check that was forged and you can identify that it's forged or not. So you don't.
But in the case of property values, though, those are very subjective. I mean, in this Mar-a-Lago case, they're saying that Mar-a-Lago is only worth $18 million.
But the property value isn't the issue. It's a misrepresentation of the square footage. And that's where the property value assessment is coming from. So
in the penthouse apartment in New York, and the legal team for Trump is making the case that there's basically 2 different ways that you can calculate the square footage, and they included things that the judge did not include. But what the $18 million,
like the walls in the sky and things that are never included.
What the $18 million Mar-a-Lago valuation tells me is that this judge is extraordinarily biased, because if you just look at the acreage alone for Mar-a-Lago, you're already at a valuation of at least $300 million. It's waterfront property in this very prime location in Florida. The idea that this entire resort is worth $18 million is absurd.
Amber, the court found not that he overstated the value of the property by a factor of 2. He didn't say it was worth 3 times what it was worth. He didn't say it was worth 10 times what it was worth. He found that it was worth 2,300% of what the property was worth. So even if you think that the judge was being uncharitable,
it's more than uncharitable, though. It's outright absurd.
But
false, totally false.
Extreme misrepresentation that's coming out of the Trump camp in terms of how he evaluated these properties, it is so out of the bounds of anybody's estimation.
I just don't think that's true. I mean, if you're saying, oh, it's 2,000% over 18 million is such a ridiculously low floor. If you were saying that he misrepresented, Mar-a-Lago's worth 600 million and he misrepresented it by $100 million. I mean, we're talking about a much lower threshold than this judge is, because they have purposely set the valuation of Mar-a-Lago at $18 million for the intention of making that 2,000% seem like he's drastically overvaluing it.
Amber,
no legitimate property estimator would ever value Mar-a-Lago at $18 million.
Amber, you keep using this number. I've not used that number.
The judge did.
I'm looking at the fact that he lied. He lied about the square footage of the property. You can't get around that. If I'm selling a house that's a 2,000 square foot house, and I say repeatedly, in order to get a higher value of the property and higher insurance assessment, that it's a 50,000 square foot property, it is not, there's no amount of crying about the bias and impartiality of a judge that's going to justify me so dramatically overestimating the square footage of my property. And Trump has to contend with that. I mean, I didn't expect that to be the controversial issue here.
No, I hear you on the square footage, and I'm not disagreeing with you on that. But the fact that the summary judgment included the Mar-a-Lago issue is what really just gets me, and why I understand why he's frustrated.
So in his ruling, the judge said Trump inflated the value of his own Trump Tower residence between, you're talking about Mar-a-Lago. So let's go to Mar-a-Lago. So are you acknowledging that the Trump Tower overestimation, the summary judgment on the Trump Tower issue is legitimate?
I think so. I would have to look more into that one, because I don't know the specifics of what the Trump legal team is claiming there in terms of having two different estimates of what the square footage is and what they included that the judge did not. I don't know the specifics on that.
So let's look at this. So the judge found that the Mar-a-Lago assessment was inflated by, that's the 2,300% number. So the judge says it's worth between $18 million and $27.6 million. So not just
ridiculous.
18, but up to $27.6 million.
It's still absurd. It's still absurd. The land alone is $300 million.
Donald Trump says it was worth between $426,529,614.
And I think that's totally on par.
And $612,110,000, et cetera, dollars. So even if your estimation was still $300,000.
I'm talking about just the land, though. I'm not talking about the building. Because there are vacant lots all around Mar-a-Lago that have recently sold for between $250 and $300 million. He's got an entire resort plus the golf course that's next to it that would most likely be included in a sale. You don't think that that whole Mar-a-Lago resort is not worth at least $100 million on top of the $300 million land value?
I'm not a real estate evaluator.
All you have to do is go on Zillow and look at all the estates next to it and what they're valuated at.
CBS ran a story at the end of last month pointing out that Donald Trump, who's claiming that Mar-a-Lago is worth $1.8 billion, his own company apparently, in some internal evaluation documents, thought that that was over $1.7 billion too high, according to some tax machinations that were going on with their internal documents. So you apparently have, I think, as part of this judgment, some internal documentation that shows that even Trump's own people didn't think that the property was worth that much.
Worth what, $1.7 billion?
$1.7 billion.
Was that, and he claimed $1.7 billion in what?
So this is what happened. This is part of what came out of the court proceeding. Apparently, a property appraiser, the petitioner agrees with the determination of the property appraiser or tax collector, a real estate broker representing Mar-a-Lago, acknowledged on a form filed with the local value adjustment board that the property was worth significantly less than what Donald Trump is now representing that it's worth now. So that's part of the court's consideration. So how is the court supposed to believe, ignore the internal evaluation of the company itself that is being prepared for different purposes than these external facing documents? And now we're supposed to believe that Donald Trump just doesn't believe his own forms that his own tax evaluators were coming up with? Doesn't that seem like a little bit of a convenient bait and switch?
Are you saying that Trump had the $1.7 billion valuation internally, or that he was presenting that to investors?
That the $1.7 billion assessment was too high according to his own tax preparers.
Okay, so then they changed it. What's the problem? What's the issue?
None of this is really necessary because the fraud stands. The summary judgment determination that he fraudulently filed documents stands on the basis of the Trump penthouse alone. So it doesn't really matter, frankly, for the purposes of the court or the purposes of what happens here outside of maybe like a damages calculation or a penalty calculation, whether or not Mar-a-Lago was also overvalued. It does seem to me to be very interesting, though, that that is what Donald Trump seems to be most bristled by, the most kind of concrete and objective finding in all of this, as opposed to some of the other accusations that he's been making, that he's being targeted politically by for 1-6 or the documents case, and that he's being treated differently than Joe Biden or some of the other people who have also taken documents. I mean, if anything, it feels like that's a stronger grounds for him to be upset, other than we can see that you live in a house that is not the square footage that you're claiming on these documents. And that's what the court determined.
Well, he's bringing up the valuation now because he just arrived in New York for the start of the trial, so.
Well, also in the courtroom, you can see the judge smiling, which conservatives online are blasting as evidence of bias.
Meanwhile, Trump's poll numbers continue to eclipse those of his opponents in the GOP primary and also President Biden's. In a hypothetical head-to-head matchup, polling by Harris X and The Messenger shows the ex-president ahead of Biden by 3 percentage points, with 45% and 43% respectively. In an interview aired this weekend, CBS's Scott Pelley asked Attorney General Merrick Garland whether he has discussed the prosecutions against Trump with President Biden. This is how he responded.
You are not in communication with the president or any member of his administration with regard to the investigation of former President Trump.
No, I am not.
If President Biden asked you to take action with regard to the Trump investigation, what would your reaction be?
I am sure that that will not happen.
The Department of Justice Special Counsel Jack Smith, tasked with investigating Trump in the criminal case, asked the judge to issue a gag order on the basis of the ex-president's ongoing attacks of witnesses, including but not limited to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. Trump, while on the trial this week, lobbed attacks aimed at Milley. Let's take a look.
Well, General Milley, what he did is really treasonous. If you look at what he said to China, he's either stupid or it's treason. But what he said to China should never be allowed. That can never be allowed in our country.
Did you suggest
and you know what, General Milley, who I know is a lazy guy, who left billions and billions of dollars worth of equipment with the Taliban. General Milley's a lazy guy who's not very smart. But what General Milley did to China and with China is a disgrace.
All right, so there's a lot going on here. Mark Milley, because of Mark Milley and Trump's argument that Milley was pushing for an invasion of Iran, and Trump's need to defend himself, that he was not the kind of wild warmongering one who was unstable that the public needed to be concerned about, but in fact, he was the one exercising discretion against more hawkish generals like Mark Milley. Making that case is how he ended up showing the document saying that this is Mark Milley's plan to invade Iran to the journalist who was writing a book, who then recorded the conversation, and which is the kind of smoking gun evidence against Donald Trump in the documents case. Now it's the fact of his anger about Mark Milley, his hawkishness, and the fact that Mark Milley ultimately led to him being exposed in the documents case is causing him to say things like he's acted in a treasonous way, and in another statement intimated that he should get the penalty that people who commit treason get, which is execution. Now, that is being used in other cases as evidence as to why Donald Trump should have a gag order against him, saying that intimidating witnesses in this way, even insinuating that they should be killed, would never fly for any other defendant in any other case in the United States, and that this justifies continued gag orders against Donald Trump, whether or not they're enforceable. So what do you make about that case for why Donald Trump should be subject to gag orders?
I just find it a little rich that the same people in the intelligence community who repeatedly accused Trump of treason, for which the punishment is death, over fake Russian collusion claims, are now going to hand-wring about what he said about Milley. I think it's extremely hypocritical. Jack Smith can, do whatever he wants through the legal channels and try to get that gag order. He's probably going to get it, to be honest with you. But I'm just not up for defending Mark Milley. document that you're talking about, the Iran document, is especially interesting in light of the fact that Milley claimed to reporters after Trump left office that he was basically the only line of defense against the crazed former president invading Iran. Then it turns out that Milley was actually the one drawing up plans to do so. He had this phone call with China that Trump is talking about, where he basically gave a heads up to Xi Jinping that the new president that was coming in was totally nuts and could start a war at any time, but don't worry, they had things under control. Everybody just calm down. He claims that he had the approval of the Defense Department to do that. Trump said he knows nothing about it. He totally bungled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, giving over weapons and the Bagram Air Force Base to the Taliban, leading to the death of that dozen or so service members who were killed by the suicide bomber. I mean, this guy to me is a total scumbag, and
yeah, I think that's completely fair.
Yeah.
But I do think the distinction, in all fairness, is whether or not there's a witness intimidation afoot here. So I think you're completely right. If the argument is Donald Trump is a raving lunatic because he's calling for people's executions and nobody's ever done that before, you're right. Everyone's been accusing everybody of treason across the political spectrum, and I don't think it's fair to say that Donald Trump is putting a fatwa on people's heads any more than anyone that accused him of treason is doing the same for him. But there is this question of whether or not in a criminal case it is witness intimidation for you to specifically be targeting people who you know are going to be witnesses in a
yeah, I mean, I guess the
you.
question would be, is it intimidation to suggest that somebody go on trial for their crimes and face just punishment if found guilty?
I mean, that is an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I just want to, before we wrap, correct myself before. It wasn't an internal evaluation that Mar-a-Lago was only worth between 18 and 28 million. It was a evaluation made by the Palm Beach County property appraiser. So a neutral evaluation, not an internal evaluation from Donald Trump.
And I have a point of clarification,
Sure.
too. On the penthouse, the difference in square footage, the reason that the Trump legal team was coming up with this different number is because they were factoring in shared ownership of things like amenities, as well as shared floor space with neighbors that they claim that they have a right to due to the fact that they're a part of this condo association. So probably a more I think there's a question there, right?
So I don't live in a 700 square foot one bedroom apartment. I in fact live in a much bigger space because I get to count the
for terms of valuation, they're basically saying that the valuation would include the shared amenities.
I think that's news to many a property owner and renter across the United States of America. I will leave that to you guys to decide and evaluate. Stick around. More Rising right after this.